All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for being here tonight. My name is Catherine. I'm one of the librarians here at Portage District Library, and it's a delight to welcome you to our event, A Conversation in Reckoning. K College uncovers its racial and colonial past. Before I introduce our guest tonight, I just want to do a little housekeeping. If you have a cell phone, please make sure you silence it or turn it off. If you do need to use the restroom at any point during the program, that is straight out the event rooms and to your left. And if you're here in person, hello to those tuning in via the live stream, we do have coffee, cookies, and other refreshments available, so please feel free to stay afterwards and mingle with our presenters. We are living at a time when many individuals and institutions are re-examining their histories to better understand their tangled roots of racism and oppression. It's just a part of our history here in America, right? We all have a hand in it. The focus of tonight's conversation is a book that does just that. It tackles this issue head on. Reckoning, Kalamazoo College uncovers its racial and colonial past. And this book tells the story of how American ideas about colonialism, and race shaped Kalamazoo College. It covers the college's history from its founding in 1833 to the present and challenges higher education to use this moment to make the deep structural changes necessary to eliminate the disparities in experiences and outcomes among students of color and their white peers. And we are going to talk about this book tonight with the author. So allow me to introduce our guests.
Okay, well, thank you for coming. I see a couple of familiar faces out there. That's always comforting. And I want to begin by thanking Anne for writing this book. It was very well researched, and she does a really great job of going into the history and so forth. So, Anne, can you tell us how you came to write the book? What was the impetus for that?
Hello everybody, thank you for being here tonight. The idea for writing this book came in 2015. At that point, I had been involved in a number of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives on campus. I gotten really involved in that work after leading a series of focus groups with students in 2013. About their experiences with race on campus, which for me was a very eye-opening experience. And I felt I'd always seen myself as an advocate for students, and I felt if I was going to continue to be an advocate for students, I needed to get involved with these issues. So I have been kind of engrossed in those issues at the college, mostly through committee work, which at first I was excited about, and then I began to become disillusioned with the efficacy of committees in bringing about real change. Around that time, I participated in the anti-racism training that the local organization Erase does. And they start that training off with a recounting of the history of the United States focused on issues of colonization and race. And there was a big timeline that was put up, and we were invited as participants to add things to the timeline. And I knew, a fair amount about the history of the college, and I knew that the college had been founded in 1833. And one of the events on the timeline was the Indian Removal Act, which Congress passed in have in the United States that, these white settlers came to this pristine wilderness, which of course was not the case. There were indigenous people living here and were managing the land to suit their purposes. And so when they arrived here, a lot had happened. There had been already, with the tribes in Michigan, tons of resistance towards U.S. colonization. Indigenous people of this area, the Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Odawa, had sent warriors along with many other tribes in the Great Lakes region and the Ohio Valley to keep white settlers from crossing the Appalachian Mountains. Those were known as the Northwest Indian Wars. And so there had been all this resistance, and then during the War of 1812, a lot of the tribes sided with the British in one last desperate attempt to try to stem American encroachment on their land. And at that point, after the war and the defeat of the British, Native people who had been at war for years did not have the resources to keep up that kind of resistance. And that's when you see all the treaties ceding. Tight then, there started to be division in the ranks. There were people who didn't approve in the community and at the college, and it ending in the forced resignations of the Stones and this entire scandalous falling apart of things that comes after that, both in town and at the college.
Yeah, because you do, in chapter 3, which is the shape of things, begin to talk about how the institution retreated into provincialism, becoming an ivory tower, insular rather, lofty, and predominantly white. How did that manifest on campus and with students?
Yeah, so the Stones, James and Lucinda Stone, resigned in 1864 in the midst of the Civil War. And then as the college regrouped, it really did not push the envelope anymore with regard to issues like that. And also after the Civil War, the whole country sort of retreated, yeah. Right? And you begin to have the lost cause narrative that kind of begins to talk about how the South wasn't fighting to defend slavery. They were fighting for states' rights and kind of trying to bring the country together by appeasing the Confederates. You begin to have the beginnings of what becomes Jim Crow after the demise of the Reconstruction era, after the federal troops pull out and the people in power in the South are able to enact all kinds of codes and laws and regulations that regulate the lives of black people almost to the point of being enslaved again. And in the North, where Kalamazoo is, of course, I think certainly at Kalamazoo College, these issues just fell away. They were no longer front of mind. And the college was very tight-knit. It was small. It was almost all white. Every now and then there would be a student of color, an international student of color, and sometimes domestic students of color, but usually one at a time and very few and far between. And so when students thought about, mostly they didn't think about black people or Chinese people or American Indians or any people of color, but when they did, it was usually in the form of sources of entertainment. There would be, blackface performances or the occasional minstrel show where they put on, or they, impersonate American Indians and do Indian calls or things like that, as like in the form of entertainment. Or it would be, has social problems, right? The Negro problem, and they would think about it in those ways. Or because it was a Baptist institution and the Christian element was quite strong back then, they were interested in missionary work. A lot of students were interested in missionary work and foreign missionary work, and they would think about, these heathen people in these other countries who needed to be saved. So that was mostly the way they interacted more with their ideas of people of color than with actual people of color.
And you kind of call that the missionary mindset.
Yeah.
Is what you,
Yeah.
how you referred to that. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the experiences in those early years of Indian and Asian students and the first African-American female graduate, Pauline Burr Johnson?
Yeah. I should also mention that the first known African-American student attended when the Stones were there before the Civil War in the late 1850s. He went on to be quite prominent in its own right, and there's been a lot written about him. His name was Rufus Perry. And probably his presence at the college, though a lot of people were abolitionists at the college and would have welcomed him, there would have been a lot of people who would not have thought that was appropriate for him to be there. Then, as I said, you would have students of color attend one at a time. One of the first students was a Chinese immigrant named Samsung Bo. He attended in the late 1880s. There were students from Burma, what's now Myanmar, a couple of students from Jamaica, a lot of time, and some students from Japan. These students usually came through Baptist connections, and they were always men. In the like 1910s or so, there was actually a period where there were about 6 or 8 students of color who attended at the same time, which was really unusual. There were 2 African-American students, 2 students from Jamaica, 2 students from Japan, and they kind of had more of an impact on campus than these students who had gone one at a time. The 2 African-American students, however, were both, could have been white passing. And I couldn't tell from what I could see in the archive whether they were trying to pass as white. They would not have had to, because there had been African-American students who had attended, but it probably would have made their social life easier. I kind of think they were, because no reference was ever made to their race, and that was a little bit unusual. Yeah. Later in the 30s, there were 3 American Indian students who came. They had been attending Bacone College out in Oklahoma, which was a college established for Native American students. And their Indianness was always being highlighted by the other students as a positive thing, even though there was a lot of stereotyping and things that we would see as racist. But sort of that made students interested in them, and I think made it easier for them to make friends. So I contrast the fact that their Indian identity was really highlighted, as opposed to the two African American students, 20 years before, whose African American identity was not highlighted at all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah. Well, also in that chapter, you talk about the social setting of white superiority and white innocence.
Mm.
And you say white people could live their entire lives without ever having to confront their inherent feelings of superiority or their dismissive treatment of people they saw as beneath them. And when I read that, it really struck me, because one of the things that it really came home to me as a student when I was there was that, and I'd never thought of this before, but there are people who really never had to think about race.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, people of color think about it all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was a real revelation to me, that there were people who, if it didn't come up, you didn't have to think about it.
Yeah, I mean, so during those years, and the shape of things, that chapter covers a lot of decades. It covers post-Civil War through World War II. And that's because even though a lot of things happen, the racial climate doesn't change much during those years. And so you have, Kalamazoo College is predominantly white, and as any predominantly white organization or town, or church, you're just interacting with other white people. At the same time, you're absorbing all these quite racist ideas about black people and other people of color from the popular culture, because of how black people and Chinese people and American Indians were portrayed. So you're absorbing that, but you're never confronting the racist quality of those ideas, unless you actually are interacting with somebody of color and there's some pushback.
Yeah.
But when I wrote that, I had just told the story about Pauline Bird, who was the first African American woman to attend Kalamazoo College. She attended in the 1920s. And we actually know a fair amount about how she experienced the college, because in the 1980s, a student did a series of oral history interviews with her and wrote her biography. That was Ruth Mordyke, who lives in town. And it was hard for me to know how those male students had experienced their time at K, because I didn't have any direct writings from them, and it's a hard thing to infer. But Pauline Bird had a terrible time, an absolutely awful time. And she did quite well academically. She was not struggling academically. During her time, they established the honors program, and she was inducted into the honors program. She did very well academically. She had grown up in Kalamazoo, and she'd been a straight-A student always. But she was so completely ostracized socially, and treated. And I think, I don't know, I think some of those students thought they may have been being kind or civil to her, at least. There was, when they were not. I mean, there was the student, Ruth Mordyke, who interviewed Pauline Bird, also interviewed some of her classmates. And one of her classmates that she interviewed, this was 60 years after the fact, said something to the effect of, I never saw Pauline as different from anyone else, but she wasn't one of those who you'd invite to your home. So it was those kinds of attitudes that she was contending with, and it was quite lonely for her. It was quite lonely. Yeah.
I do remember an incident. I don't know if I think I read about it in your book, but just going to chapel and
Pauline Bird told the story. There was weekly chapel, and the chapel at Kalamazoo College has, there's different sides. So the boys would sit on one side, or the male students would sit on one side, and the female students would sit on the other. And then when they would process out, the man coming from one side and the woman coming from the other would meet and walk out together. Well, sometimes the male student she was meeting would refuse to walk out with her, and she would have to walk out by herself. So she described that as a small thing that would happen. Yeah.
And that, compared to some of the other things, I'm sure there was a small thing. In chapter 4, Behind the Mask, You make much of the minstrel shows, very strong objections expressed by Dwayne Roberts, who was at that time a leader in the African American community, and the rationalizations the college had for continuing them. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Mm-hmm. There had been minstrel shows that had occurred on campus here and there for many decades, as there had been at most predominantly white institutions. But in the 1950s, one of the men's societies, the Century Forum, there used to be these men's and women's societies who would kind of like drive the social life. They would create a lot of the social activities. One of the activities that the Century Forum began doing every year was a minstrel show, and this was a full-blown, very traditional minstrel show with all the students wearing blackface makeup and doing skits and these musical numbers and portraying black people in very derogatory ways. It was a very popular event, not only among students, but faculty and staff would go. Started in 1949, and it went until about 1956. In 1953, they gave the show in town as well. And after that, there are a number of community members contacted the college to complain, and one was Dwayne Roberts, who was running the Douglas Association then. So the college was getting these complaints. They, were kind of trying to figure out how to handle it, because I think, the Century Forum had also a strong alumni base, and I don't think they wanted to upset anybody. There were also, I will note, African-American students on campus at this time. So there's meetings, and there is, we'll talk to the Centuries, and the members of the Century Forum they have a hard time understanding the objections. Well, is it the blackface makeup, or is it the show, or is it the jokes, or what is it exactly? Okay, well, we'll promise not to, wear so much blackface makeup. And then the vice president of the college tried to explain, well, yeah, there are jokes about Negroes, as they said at the time, but there are also jokes about Irish and Scottish, and so it was not understood what the issue was. So the show kept being offered for a number more years. Finally, there was a new dean of men that the college had hired, Paul Collins, and he had previously been the dean of students at an historically black college. So he had greater sensibility about issues of race than most people at the college, and he took it upon himself to bring an end to the minstrel shows, and they finally stopped after the 1956 performance, but it was not easy.
Yeah. And did you say it went on through early 60s, or just?
Not with the blackface. They continued to offer something they called a showboat. At first it was called the Blacktown Jamboree, and then it was called the Showboat, and it continued to be called the Showboat, but there was no more blackface. I'm sure there was still cringy things that happened, but I just didn't have a good access to records of that in the archives. Usually when there was humor, that's when kind of racist ideas would kind of come out and under the guise of humor. Yeah.
So moving into the 60s, and you're describing, what life was like for students during the 60s. And I know that at this point you were looking to interview, do some oral histories with, black students who had gone to school during the 60s. And I think you had some problems getting people to be willing to do those interviews.
Yes, and this is when I got to know Donna, because I had this idea that I would, as part of my research, do oral histories with alumni of color. And I was I would have started with alums in the 1950s, but the alums who were still alive were quite frail, so I was working in the 60s. Donna had been quite involved in doing oral history interviews, and she had also been working with a professor of English, Bruce Mills, on an oral history project. So Donna kind of trained me in how to do these interviews, and also helped me reach out to these alumni of color, because we didn't know how they would respond to a white woman asking to interview them about their experience as black students back in the 60s. So you helped me reach out. And in the 60s, things began to change in terms of the racial makeup of the college, because after the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, there started to be an uptick in the number of black students who were enrolling. And then by the late 60s, there were about 40 black students on campus, which was only about 3% of the student body, but it was many, many more black students than had ever been on campus. And there ended up being, after Martin Luther King was assassinated, the black students organized and formed the Black Student Organization, and there's intense activism about, trying to tell the administration of the college that they need to make the college experience more relevant to black students. This was happening at institutions all over the country, and it was known as the Black Campus Movement. And I wanted to interview black students from the 60s in general, but I was particularly interested in interviewing the black students who'd been involved in those protests, which got pretty heated, especially in 1969.
Yeah.
But the students, and I did have students who I did interviews with who agreed to be interviewed, but the students who were most involved, or the alums who had been most involved in the protests in 1969, none of them would agree to talk with me about it.
Yeah. One of the things that you talk about is just that you felt like there were just very few meaningful interactions between students during that time. And I was a student from 63 to 67. Mm-hmm. And I think, at that time we were coming out of the 50s and the 40s, and things were pretty separate, mm-hmm. in the country. And so coming to a college like Kalamazoo College for me was like, well, I had more of a cultural shock. I always say that than when we did foreign studies. So you mentioned that, the fact that there were so few serious interaction. Can you talk a little bit more about that? And did any of the other students that you interviewed have those same feelings, or?
Well, especially when it got to be the later part of the decade, the black students, the Black Power movement starts right in the late 1960s, and so the black students, and there's black consciousness raising, and the Black is Beautiful, and transitioning from Negroes to black people. So the students on campus began meeting, and they were reading Charles Hamilton and Stokely Carmichael and reading about Black Power principles, and part of it was separatism, right? Integration has not been, attempts to integrate were not working out so well, and so part of it was separatism, and so there was sort of intentional, in some ways, separatism that was going on, which was disturbing to a lot of white students. It's kind of like white people may not in a place like Kalamazoo College interact with black students or be curious about black students or try to get to know black students, but when the black students say, no, we want to be by ourselves, and that's very threatening and alarming then to white people.
Yeah. Now, a lot of what you're talking about happened after I left.
Yeah.
When I was there were just 3 black students on campus, mm-hmm. in my class, I should say. And so we were sort of forced to be a part of the rest of the community if we could. So that was a little different. And do you remember the book, Why Do All the Black Students Sit Together in the Cafeteria? There is a book actually called that. And she talks about how not only a lot of what you're talking about is happening, mm-hmm. the identity and all of that, as far as race is concerned, but that all students actually go through a period during that time, during those ages, the college age, that they're looking for their identity, mm-hmm. and kind of being more comfortable mm-hmm. around people more like themselves. Mm-hmm. So I think a lot of that might have played into it too.
But tell about your story about trying to date at a place like Kalamazoo College.
Well, there was no trying to date. I mean, it's not something that happened. So no, there was no interracial dating. I remember, and this is funny, when we first came on campus as freshmen, they had a little social thing for us outside, because it was still warm. And one of the students asked me, there was sort of an after party at in one of the men's. So, and Anne talks about this in the book, and I mentioned to her that, and so he invited me to over to the dorm where they were having the party and everything. And I always, and it was fine, nothing happened, and I always wondered, what kind of pushback he might have gotten on that or whatever. And so I've actually been in touch with this person lately, because we're both on a committee from the college, and he doesn't even remember it. So, because I wanted to tell him, that you were one of the people who really made me feel comfortable and welcoming and that sort of thing. So he's very happy to hear that he had been the person who had done that. However, he doesn't really mention it, and he doesn't really remember it. So I'm guessing that he didn't get any pushback on it. I'm not sure, because I think he would have, remembered it had he done that. But I think since I told you that story, I had not asked him about that. So, now, when I returned in 1993, because I went back to Chicago, and I was pursuing a career and all of that, and then my husband and I decided to come back here because we wanted a quieter life. I'm not sure that happened, but anyway, the thing that struck me when we got back to Kalamazoo was things didn't seem to be so different from the way they'd been when I graduated in '67, and of course I went back and sort of renewed my ties with the college, if you want to call it that. So I felt like there had really been very little change, even though there were more black students of color on campus, and I found that students were feeling the same way I was feeling in the 60s. And I don't know, can you talk about why you think that might be?
Yes.
Okay.
So in the late 60s, when the Black Student Organization was having quite intense protests that really did galvanize the campus and had the attention of the administration, and there was, when I'm reading that stuff in the archives, that you have this feeling, maybe something will change. There was going to be curricular change, and there was going to be change in the speakers who were brought, and there were going to be change in social programs. But after the protests died down, you come into the 70s, any attempts to do those things just fall by the wayside because the student pressure is stopped, and so everything kind of snaps back to the way it was before. The chapter after the 60s, I call it the brick wall, and that's a quote from a woman who had been, an African-American woman who had been a student in the 70s and then came back as a professor of history in the later 80s and into the 90s. She was the second African-American professor to be hired after the first African-American professor was hired in the midst of the protest, Dr. Romeo Phillips, and then it took 16 years more before the second African-American professor was hired. But anyways, her name was Sandra Green. And so she was asked to be involved in anything relating to any diversity, equity, inclusion. Her expertise was in African studies, so she was doing that, but then she was also asked to be the part-time director of multicultural affairs, and then she was an assistant provost for, diversity hiring or things like that. Anyway, at one point she said she left, and I said, why did you leave? And she said, it was so frustrating, it was like banging my head up against the brick wall. That's why. And I said, what was the nature of the brick wall? And she said, nice, polite, liberal talk. So you just can't get anywhere. Yeah, it's like you agree, but then you don't do the actions, and it's incredibly frustrating. So in the later 80s and into the 90s, at Kalamazoo College and elsewhere in higher education, you have moves to become more multicultural. We talked a lot about multiculturalism. And so this is really the first time higher ed begins to examine the curriculum and realize it is completely, white male European. And so there begin to be efforts on campus that are quite divisive. The faculty, have a lot of disagreements about this, and there's a lot of tension in the student body. In the midst of this, there's Rodney King is beaten badly by police, and that affects what's going on college campuses, and so it was a time of a great amount of tension. But interestingly, during that time, there was a president who was behind these efforts, which is an unusual thing to have a president who'll get out in front of diversity efforts. But he was. And so, again, you get this feeling like maybe things will change. And some things did change. The curriculum began to change. But then there's a financial crisis in the mid-90s, and part of when people lose their jobs, and part of what happens is they eliminate the Office of Multicultural Affairs, and all of these initiatives that have been set into motion kind of stop, and then the black faculty and staff, who they had made some strides in hiring more black faculty and staff, they were like, we're done. And so as soon as they could find another job, there was mass resignation of many black faculty and staff. And then I began working at the college just a couple of years after that. And so when I started again, it was again very, very white. The student body, the faculty and staff, there had been some progress that was made that was lost. And I didn't even know all that stuff had happened. Okay. And people talked about the financial crisis, or they referred obliquely to the culture wars, but I did not know. And it was just a few years before I started. It wasn't talked about. There was a lot of talk about diversity, and we need to have a more diverse student body, but it was talked about in this helpless way that I didn't understand until I did the research and realized what had happened before. So things don't really start to begin to change at the college until the 2000s, when the college hires Eileen Wilson Oyalaran, who was the first woman and also the first African-American president. And one thing she did was she said, we're going to diversify the student body. We're going to diversify the student body. Because it had been like this, seen as this, undoable task. And the college did begin to diversify the student body. And so that by the time, in the mid, 20-teens, there was a critical mass of students of color on campus. And I had always very naively thought that students of color would have a better experience at the college if there were more students of color, right? That it was a matter of numbers. And then you have more numbers, and students of color are still having the same experiences they've always had. They just have the strength in numbers to be more vocal about it. Because the culture hadn't changed. Yeah. You're having more students of color does not change the fundamental culture. Right. And so that's what Kalamazoo College and other institutions of higher education continue to struggle with. Yeah.
One other thing, and I sometimes forget to ask you about this, but you mentioned that often when you would do the diversity training or have your sessions or whatever, people would bring up foreign study as a way to kind of say that we are being more open or whatever. How did they use that as a way of saying maybe things are better because we have foreign study?
Yeah, those of you who are familiar with Kalamazoo College know that it has a very robust study abroad program. And when I was involved with a number of other people when we were running these efforts, we had the focus group report, and then the next year we had discussions around the focus group report with faculty and staff. You cannot, and part of it's probably because I was not adept at running conversations about race, but you cannot get people to talk about race, cannot. And so one of the safe havens was to go, oh, well, I know an international student, or we have cultural diversity with study abroad, or we have this, and that was like a safe haven that always was the place to go to not talk about domestic diversity and issues of race in the United States. So it was I always found that frustrating, but Yeah.
Yeah,
There's not the same thing.
no,
Yeah.
and it is hard to talk about. I
It
mean,
is,
you
it
know,
is, yeah.
we used to have community conversations, you know, and deliberately have these conversations and just try to get people to be comfortable being uncomfortable. But I want to kind of suggest something that I just saw on, I think it was on Hulu. If you get Hulu, the name of the show, and it's just 2 parts, is called The School That Tried to End Racism. And it's just really interesting. They're working with younger kids, and it just, the younger kids in this reflect a lot of what's going on with adults, you know, and they're young enough so that before that, they weren't really thinking about any of this, and they were, you know, getting along fine, and or thinking they were, and so they go through a lot of changes, and it ends up being pretty positive, and I think that it's just a good thing for us to see. And this is in England, by the way; it's not even here, so I would recommend that to people. But with the book, what do you want people to take away from this book?
I think the book, in the end, is a lot about how white supremacy manifests among well-meaning white people. Because, you know, Kalamazoo College has always been led by well-meaning white people, and people who see themselves as progressive and concerned about issues of race. And yet, you know, we have all absorbed what's in the water. You know, the water we swim in this country is white supremacy, meaning that white people are in control of the narrative, white people have the power, white people basically run the show. And the systems that keep that in place, and the way that people of color are portrayed versus the way white people are portrayed, and how that we absorb that, and to become aware of that takes some effort, you know, and to undo that takes even more effort.
Oh, absolutely.
And so I guess I kind of hope that the book can help. I hope white people see how you can be a nice, well-meaning person and still perpetuate racism in this country. And maybe begin to see, I mean, for me, this has been quite the personal journey as well. I mean, I had thought a lot about race and my role in this country before I started the book, but it deepened much more in the process. And so in many ways, it was a painful experience. But it's really necessary to, I mean, it's not our fault. I mean, we absorb all the stuff that's out there, but it's really necessary to become aware of the reactions we're having, or the thoughts we're having, or the things, or how the things we're doing, which may not seem to us to have anything to do with race, how they may have a negative impact on people of color.
Wait a minute, now you're not talking about being woke, are you?
Yeah.
That might be a problem.
Yeah,
Okay.
Woke means awake, you know. Woke means to be awake and aware of what's going on around you.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Anyway, at this point, we do like to ask if there are any questions. Any of you guys have questions that I didn't ask?
Well, one of the things that, I guess this is to either one of you, but one of the things as I try to
You know what? I'm going to bring the microphone to you.
Okay, I can be louder.
Okay. Use your teacher voice. Oh, okay.
One of the things that I find as I try to engage and learn and change is that this whole thing of racism and white privilege, it's so everywhere that it gets overwhelming, that it feels like, you know, I can try to lead my life the best I can to not
perpetuate this, but you're only one person. Even if you run a big organization, you're only one person, and you're only one organization in a huge thing. And so, but I feel, and I was just recently reading something that Pope Francis had written, and he said, that's not a reason not to do what you can do. To work for every bit that you can, for you and the people around you, and try to help, and try to kind of unmask this thing that's all around. So I wonder, what do you think about that? You're saying yes, overwhelming to it, and I wonder, what do you think about that? After living your life and experiencing the experiences that you've had, how do you go on, and how do you approach this?
Yeah, it takes one person at a time. And, when we do our workshops and that sort of thing, we get that kind of question a lot. And what we want people after the end of the series that we do is to determine who they are, where they are on what we call the spectrum, because there are people on this end of the spectrum who really haven't thought about this before, hadn't read anything, hadn't been open to it at all. And then there are other people on the other end of the spectrum who are, just very aware, very active and all of that. But no matter where you are on that spectrum, there is something that you can do as an individual, even if it just means reading more books that give you more knowledge about this, opening your mind to it, stepping up when you see an injustice. Everybody doesn't have to march. Everybody doesn't have to be really active in organizations necessarily. But every person can do something, and you can determine, just from who you are and what you have to give, because each of us has something to give. And whatever that gift is that you have, if you can use your gift in some way to make it better, to become the people that we want to be. Yeah.
I completely agree with that. And I guess I would also just add, when we were talking earlier about white people being insulated, and not realizing even that maybe they have, ideas about race that maybe are not the best. White people are very segregated in this country. And so the more that you can even just bring it up among your white friends and family, because so many white people really do not think about this, and it just kind of, even if you feel like you're not getting anywhere, you brought it up, and if you kind of just keep doing that, it can at least make it part of the conversation, maybe begin to get some other people thinking twice about things.
Other questions? I see a hand over here.
Hi. Thank you for being here. It was really interesting. I wanted to ask how the reaction after the publication of the book was, if there was any backlash from the college, if you were welcomed. Did anybody approach you after, any negative reactions? I'm curious.
I have to say, the whole time I was writing this book, I was imagining backlash. It hasn't come. So if there's backlash, it has not been to me. The college administration has been very supportive. They contributed money to the cost of publication. The president gave a book to all the members of the Board of Trustees, and they were to read it, and I was then invited to speak with the Board of Trustees. Donna and I did an event on the book at homecoming last fall. A few faculty members are using it in class. And there's a reading group right now on campus of faculty and staff that's reading the book. So I'm sure there are people who are not happy with at least parts of the book, but I have not heard about it directly or even indirectly. So.
You look surprised. I was too. Yeah. It's good.
Other questions? Yeah.
Is it possible that there is an over-discussion of race at this point no, just a minute, let me finish. At this point in time, because it has gotten progressively more over the last 50 years that I've been around at least.
There's never a time when there's over-discussion about
And if there is that causing more of a racial divide because people are just getting tired of hearing race all the
No.
time? You don't think so?
No.
I'm tired
It
of it.
needs to be talked about.
I'm
It
tired
needs
of
to
it.
be talked about.
Well, I know it
Well,
needs to
that
be
may be
talked
you, but
I think there's a lot of
it's
other
something
people
that
are
we've
tired of
put,
it,
you know,
too.
we've stuck under the rug for too long. And we just really need to, you know, sort out our feelings about it and bring it out in the open. That's part of the problem.
That people aren't discussing it?
You must not be tired, but you wouldn't be here.
I'm just interested in seeing what
I see.
people think, what you think, what,
Yeah.
you know, be aware of what's going
Yeah.
on. But,
I definitely don't think that it's over talked about.
okay.
I've got that question before. I usually get it
Okay,
from a
really?
mail. I find that interesting. But anyway,
Well,
no.
no, I just pose that as a possibility.
Yeah.
that
I understand.
Maybe.
It's a good question. I think
maybe-
it's an
maybe we're
excellent
going too
question.
far. Maybe
Yeah.
we're not, I don't know.
It's an
I mean,
excellent
certainly
question.
Our history would say that there's a lot
Yeah.
to talk about
Yeah. Well, so many of us
That they
don't
don't-
know our
that they
history.
don't teach in schools.
Yeah. So many of us don't know our history. We probably wouldn't even have to have this discussion if we really knew our
If
history.
we grew up with it from the time we're,
Yeah. We grew up with our own experiences, but, you know, it's important to know the whole story.
was K College ever involved with the Underground Railroad?
With
Or
what?
The Underground Railroad?
Did you read that at all? That I don't think so. Yes, absolutely. Right, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, as far as I know, there was no activity in the college with that. Yeah. Yeah, that maybe we don't know about. That's possible, since it was underground. Yeah, it's possible. One person that most people don't know was involved in the Underground Railroad was, okay. Just, it's a senior moment here. But anyway, you know the big house on Oakland Drive. No. It's across from where the archives used to be. I can't think of it now, but he used to be the president of the psychiatric hospital, the state hospital. And he was probably the first person who brought people in through the years, just a couple, that he brought in through the Underground Railroad. And then he used to live elsewhere. And he, you know, had people come through his house. Yep. It belongs to Western now. Yeah. Anyway, it'll come to me at 3 o'clock in the morning. I'll call all of you, and
I think we've all had that experience before. Thank you for those insightful questions. Are there other questions? We've got another hand back here. Anyone else? All right. Thank you.
How would you describe the current racial climate at Kalamazoo College for in comparison to, you know, the timeline? Where are we now?
I didn't really hear her.
The current racial climate.
Oh, yeah, you can answer.
So I have not worked at the college since 2019, so I'm not up on the latest. But it's definitely a work in progress. I think it's being discussed a lot, and I think some people might feel, as you do, that maybe it's being discussed too much, and others feel that it can't be discussed enough. The thing is, when you start talking about race, you can't expect it to be easy, right, or comfortable. And so, you know, especially white people will especially feel discomfort because we're used to always feeling comfortable around issues of race. So I think, you know, I think it's an uncomfortable time at the college. And it's uncomfortable because they're trying to work through things. And so that's positive, but it's going to take time, and it's not going to be, it won't be easy. You know, it's not an easy road, but it's a necessary road, and I think it's definitely worthwhile, and will lead to such a better situation for really everybody. Okay.
It's Henry Montague, and that house is Montague House. Okay. And yeah, most people do. And as a matter of fact, he and his wife were very active in the First Congregational Church, and the church really wasn't even aware of how active he was, you know, with the Underground Railroad. He was an active abolitionist and all of that. So just a little trivia there.
Oh, another question?
Well, I just, maybe a comment, and I just, you know, it's hard. I know, Anne, what you're saying, it's going to take time. But I also think, why is it going to take time?
Right.
Why is this going to take time? Why do people have to suffer through this? You know, it's just, and it's hard to control angry feelings and go into, it's just, it's, you know,
Yeah.
it's just a tough thing to, I don't have a good question, but I'm just telling you, I'm struggling with this.
No, thank you for saying that, because I definitely don't want to make it sound like I believe it should take time. Yeah, because that's been always what's been said. Well, these things take time, and it'll happen slowly, and, you know, gradualism. You know, and as James Baldwin said, it's taking my mother's time, it's taking my father's time, it's taking my nieces and nephews' time. You know, how much time do you need? So that's why I think that we need to get in and hang in. It's just that, in my experience, it's hard. And I mean, you know, Black people, other people of color who are on the receiving end of this, think about it way, 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 way more than white people, and have a much deeper analysis and understanding of it. So as white people, we start, you know, back at square one for the most part. We have a lot of catching up to do and trying to figure these things out. And for us, it's, you know, it can be things we don't want to know. You know, when I did this history, a lot of my historical heroes fell from their pedestals, you know? And that is sort of a hard thing, you know? Who can you look back, you know, and feel proud of, you know, as a white person who did the right thing? They're few and far between. And I think there, you know, there is that, then it can be construed as, well, this is just making white people feel bad, or it's making white children feel bad, and we shouldn't make them feel bad. That's not the intent here, to make white people feel bad. We might feel bad because we feel bad about what's happened in the past. I mean, I don't know how you can get around that. But we're living now, you know, and so we have the opportunity now as white people to do the things that our descendants can look back and be proud of us for, instead of looking back on their grandmother and cringing about what their grandmother did or said, right? So I think, you know, that's why it's important for white people to stay in it, even though it can be a painful thing. It will be a painful thing. But it can also be so, I mean, your understanding just expands so hugely. I mean, it's better to know the truth about things, and then you can begin to work in a more positive way.
Other questions? I see a hand over here.
Maybe this is a multi-part question, but just wondering about what the administration, what the power is now racially at K College, and is part of the problem that it's taking so long is that people of color aren't the architects of the solution, which they very much need to be. So I'm just wondering what that, you know, who is leading these changes, and yeah, I guess if you could speak to that.
So the leadership of the college is fairly diverse at the moment. The president, Jorge Gonzalez, is Mexican American. I believe the dean of students is African American, and there's an African American woman who is the vice president for advancement. And that's all very positive. It's but it's still a lot to, overcome. Like when Barack Obama was the president of the United States, right? He could only do so much, and really, sometimes it's hard to be out in front when people expect you to be, or, you might be, you have to, you're dealing with a lot of different constituencies. So I think the college has been doing a good job in getting more representational diversity among the leadership and among the faculty and staff and among the students. There's still a ways to go. But that institutional culture is just a formidable thing. It really is. Ibram Kendi, who wrote How to Be an Anti-Racist and Stand from the Beginning, talks about all the time the importance of looking at policy. Because, look at the policies, because policy, that's like race neutral. Very, very little is race neutral. Almost everything, there's almost nothing that's race neutral. So you start to look at policies and procedures and how it impacts different groups of people, and you begin, to see where the disparities are. But it's hard for people to change the way they've always done things, and I think that's part of it. And it's also, I agree with you, it's hard for white people to see what needs to be done, so it's important to have people of color being the architects. And at the same time, a professor of color at K College needs to get tenure like everybody else and probably doesn't need the added work of trying to solve, so it's just kind of is complicated. But I would say that maybe that's partly why it takes time. I don't know. I would love to find the thing that makes things happen faster. I feel like in times of great turmoil, that's when in unrest, like we're in now, where it's painful, but also, and everything's out there, all the good, the bad, the ugly, it's all out there. It was like that in the 1850s, before the Civil War. It was like that in the late 60s. It's like that now. I feel like those times where things are really heated up, when I have the opportunity to maybe push things dramatically in a good direction. But there are those forces that are trying to keep the status quo at the same time, so it just takes a lot of effort. So, yeah. Do you want to say? Yeah.
What happened after Reconstruction?
Backlash.
Yeah. And so you always get that really strong backlash. So it's always that push and pull, And I know there are a lot of people who you mentioned, the black professors who might be there just trying to get their tenure. And so some of them really resent having to feel like it's their responsibility to handle that. So it does get to be really complicated. That little program that I told you about, at one point they separated the students. They had the white students in one room and the black students in another, and they were, just kind of talking about their experiences and how they were feeling about this experiment and all of that and how they thought they were doing. And the white students really had a hard time talking. They just couldn't talk about it. They were very uncomfortable. And the room with the students of color, they were laughing and having a good time. So it was a major contrast, and that's why I think this program is so interesting to see, because it's kind of a little version of the big us, But yeah, it is complicated, and I have heard a lot that African Americans just, they resent having to take the burden.
I haven't heard of other colleges who are exploring the racial history as a result of this book. It may be happening. There's certainly a lot of institutions that were exploring their racial history before this book. Especially, it kind of started in the Ivy Leagues as they began to realize or maybe acknowledge that a lot of their wealth came from involvement in the slave trade. I mean, those are old institutions, and the more southern institutions had enslaved people on their campuses or who built those campuses, and a lot of the northern institutions, they had their endowments invested in the slave trade. So a lot of Georgetown and Brown and University of Michigan has started to look into this. More and more institutions are doing it. University of Virginia. They're not all writing books. They may be doing different things. They may be creating websites or kind of changing the physical, what's memorialized on campus and monuments and things like that. But it's becoming, I think, more and more common for institutions to look into their past in this way. I think one thing usually it's been really clear things like investment in the slave trade, or there are monuments to Confederate leaders. I think at a place like Kalamazoo College, which is in the Midwest and was founded a little later, there's this idea that it doesn't have a racist past. But of course it does, because any United States organization or institution has been steeped in that, and it just manifests differently, right? Which is I tried to show in the book. So I feel it's something that every institution really should explore to have a better understanding of their current racial climate on campus and to hopefully make it better.
All right. Well, an eager audience with questions. We've actually run out of time for our program, so I just wondered if Donna and if you want to share any last final remarks, maybe from each of you about this experience.
I really appreciate Donna and her friendship and her willingness to do these events with me. And I appreciate all of you very much for being interested in this and coming out tonight.
Yeah, thank you all for coming. And again, I'll thank Anne for the book. And thank Catherine for having us.
All right. Well, let's give our presenters a round of applause. Thank you. I think they're willing to hang around for a couple of minutes if you still have another question. Why don't you do it over a cup of coffee and a cookie in the next room? And thank you to those who tuned in online through YouTube. Have a wonderful evening.